These videos are made possible with the help of those that support me on Patreon, so thank you guys for your constant support, and if you want to support me, you can click on the link on your screen right now, or click the link in the description below. Thanks a lot. Hello everybody, my name is Tyler Valle, and welcome to the second episode of The Sins of Our Publishers, a series where I take a look at the sins that publishers commit against not only you as the consumer, but those that work with them and under them. In last week's episode, we covered Nintendo, Ubisoft, and Electronic Arts, and at the beginning of that video, I told you guys that if there was anything that I missed from that list that you think should be added to the list, if I thought it was good enough, I'll add it to this week's episode, and that's exactly what you guys did. So before we begin with today's publishers, let's cover some things that I forgot. When it comes to Nintendo, I forgot to mention that they have a horribly anti-YouTuber policy where they will content claim any Nintendo-related gameplay footage on your channel, or DMCA you. This has led to a lot of YouTubers, most notably Angry Joe, outright refusing to cover Nintendo-related gameplay footage ever again, due to the fact that they don't believe that Nintendo deserves any of their money based on their hard work making this content. Second, I brought up Xenoblade Chronicles as being a problem with Nintendo, when more evidence goes to the contrary, saying that it's actually a problem with GameStop. I should have done better research than what I did, and I apologize for misleading people. The problem was at GameStop's fee. They would actually print out only a few thousand copies of the game without the shrink wrap, then call it used, and then sell it for an inflated price of $90. That was all on GameStop's head, not on Nintendo's, and I apologize for that. Another thing that I forgot to mention when it comes to Nintendo was the Super Smash Bros. 3DS ban system, which would seemingly at random ban people for 136 years. While there has been no official acknowledgement by Nintendo that this was happening, it seems this died down after a while, though I'm sure there are still people out there who are banned. When it comes to EA, I forgot to mention that when they released that free-to-play Dungeon Keeper app, they rigged it so only 5-star reviews would get through on the app review system. 1 through 4-star reviews would lead you to a feedback page on how to help them improve the game, meaning only 5 stars would show up. They kept doing this until they were caught and subsequently apologized for this. This was some really shady shit, and I really feel bad for forgetting to add it to the list. So thanks guys for your diligence and helping me out, and once again, if I miss anything in today's episode, make sure to let me know in the comment section below, and I'll make sure to add it at the beginning of the next week's episode. Today I'm going to be covering 5 publishers, 3 of them in depth, and 2 of them are going to be dishonorable mentions. Once again, I want to remind you guys that these are not based upon their severity, and are instead based upon where the publisher sat on Metacritic in the year 2014. I also want to remind you guys that just because these publishers have done wrong in the past, it doesn't mean that they won't do good things as well. Nintendo, Ubisoft, and even Electronic Arts have done good things when it comes to publishing, and they will do good things in the future. So with all of that out of the way, and all the disclaimers said, I think we can finally begin. First up in today's list is Sony. Now this one's going to be really hard for me because I'm a huge Sony fanboy. I own a PlayStation 2, a PlayStation 3, a PS4, PSP, and I'm even going to buy a Vita. But I have to put all my bias aside to give you guys the facts. And factually speaking, I think Sony has by far the worst sin on this list. Even if it's only one, it's so big that I think everybody who even knows about video games has at least heard about this. This sin was based in an entire month in which Sony tried to undo the 4th largest data breach of all time. If I had to spell it out for you guys, I would say that Sony's biggest sin in the world of gaming was their inability to protect their users prior to the PSN hack of 2011. This security breach caused Sony to shut down the PlayStation Network on April 20th of 2011, but not before roughly 77 million users had their accounts compromised. This was such a massive data breach that multiple governments had officials speak out against Sony for their inability to protect their users and even alert them as to what was going on, because it was an entire week before Sony let people know that they were being hacked. This is made even worse by the fact that Sony admitted that around 2,500 accounts had their information taken off the PlayStation Network and placed on several websites. This information even included users' names and some addresses. And while there is no links of credit card fraud to the people who were affected by the PlayStation Network hack, it doesn't even matter in the end because this shouldn't have happened in the first place. It wasn't until May 23rd of the same year that the PlayStation Network finally went back up. Slowly but surely, people were able to be shuffled back into the PlayStation Network to get back to playing their games. And those that were affected were compensated by 2 free PS3 games from a list and 2 free PSP games from a list. And those that were PlayStation subscribers at the time were even compensated with certain extra features, such as access to Music Unlimited and things of that nature. However, I really don't think getting 2 free PS3 games from a limited list really allows people to feel comfortable giving their credit card information back to Sony, especially after what happened last year. Because even though this was the 4th largest data breach of all time that people who were even roughly interested in games and technology knew about, it wasn't going to be the last of Sony's hacking woes. Because on November 24th of 2014, there was another massive leak of information, this time coming out of Sony's movie department, after yet another data breach. This would include personal information on employees, emails, executive salaries, and even unreleased movies. To this day, it's not even completely known who was behind this hack, beyond the fact that they call themselves the Guardians of Peace. They claim that they were attacking Sony because they were going to be releasing the movie The Interview, a movie starring Seth Rogen and James Franco making fun of North Korea, the North Korean regime, and Kim Jong-un. This led many people, including the United States government, to accuse North Korea of the crime. Sony twice was unable to defend their users and even their own employees from being hacked. They tried to cover up both events before they became too big to be covered up. And really, if anyone gave back their trust to Sony after the 2011 hack, it was once again torpedoed by Sony's inability to even defend their own employees in 2014. Sony really needs to step up to the plate and upgrade their security. Maybe Norton Antivirus and McAfee just aren't cutting it anymore. Second up on today's list is Square Enix, whose list of recent problems rank on the longer side. So let's start with the obvious. Back in 2006, there was 2 games announced by Square Enix, if you remember. Final Fantasy 13 and then another PlayStation 3 exclusive title. Do you remember it? Final Fantasy Versus 13 was announced to take place in the same universe as Final Fantasy 13 and Type 0, a PSP title that up until recently wasn't even released in the West. The only information that really came out about Final Fantasy Versus 13 beyond the fact that it was supposed to be a PlayStation 3 exclusive was that the man Tetsuya Nomura was supposed to go and work on this title. Unfortunately, after its announcement, beyond being told that yes, we're still working on it, Final Fantasy Versus 13 went absolutely dormant for nearly a decade before re-emerging as Final Fantasy 15, with Hajime Tabata at the helm. Final Fantasy Versus 13's announcement is a sin due to the fact that it was announced around the time that people weren't totally okay with the new console generation. People were still up in the air about whether or not they wanted to own an Xbox 360 or a PS3. And with the announcement that this game was going to be PlayStation 3 exclusive, it led a lot of people to bite the bullet and buy the vastly more expensive console when it came to the PS3. This choice ultimately would not even pay off for them due to the fact that they now have to buy yet another console to play the game that they were promised around the time this game releases, I would say about 10 years ago. Another major problem, and I would dare call it a sin, of Square Enix is their inability to actually want to localize any of their JRPGs that are not Final Fantasy, and the fear that it may damage the Golden Child. And while if you were to ask me, I would say Final Fantasy 13 did enough damage to its franchise, that is just my opinion. But what is not my opinion is the fact that Square Enix is sitting on yet another JRPG franchise that is just as big as Final Fantasy and could be even bigger if they were to actually localize it. I'm talking of course about Dragon Quest, a franchise that is so well known that there is an urban myth in Japan based around the idea that after Dragon Quest III was released, the Japanese government actually had to pass a law making it illegal to sell Dragon Quest games on any days other than Fridays or holidays due to the fear that people would not go to work or go to school because they were at home playing. Dragon Quest is huge in Japan, and it could be easily just as big as Final Fantasy if it was marketed correctly here in the West. Unfortunately, they don't want to take that necessary risk to actually see if they'd be able to pull any profits. Yes, of course, we're getting Dragon Quest Heroes by the end of the year, but I think we're getting that one more because it's a Dynasty Warriors game and less because it's a Dragon Quest game. And with the announcement of Dragon Quest VIII being ported to the 3DS with new content, one can only hope that Square Enix or Nintendo will step in to actually publish the game outside of Japan. That way, more people will be able to play what is, in my opinion, the greatest JRPG of all time. Another example of Square's inability to publish things that are actually marketable is Bravely Default, a game that they didn't even want to localize until Nintendo stepped in to localize it for them. After it was localized in the West, the game got stunning reviews and even won GameSpot's 3DS Game of the Year of 2014 and was nominated in IGN's 3DS Game of the Year. But Square Enix didn't want to localize it until Nintendo stepped in. And while we're on the topic of Final Fantasy, JRPGs, and Square Enix, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that they are now trying to DLC scum you with the Final Fantasy franchise. You saw them start it with Final Fantasy 13-2, and you saw it even get worse in Final Fantasy Lightning Returns, and even though I'm excited for Final Fantasy 15, I can almost guarantee you we're going to see it in Final Fantasy 15 as well. And while there's more I could probably talk about when it comes to Square Enix Japan, I'd rather move on to their Western studios, or rather how they treat their Western studios. If you don't remember, back in 2011, Square Enix suffered some heavy losses due to the fact that Final Fantasy 14 was all around a financial failure, and after that they had two choices. The first one was being acknowledging their failure, shutting down the game and apologizing, or B, closing the game, rebuilding it, and re-releasing it as something new. They chose the second option with Yoshi P at the helm to actually rebuild Final Fantasy 14 as Final Fantasy 14 Realm Reborn. However, the financial losses are still there. So you would think a company that would make such a boneheaded decision as trying to run two MMOs at the same time, which are Final Fantasy 11 and Final Fantasy 14, would be beyond the fact that they would actually push off all of their flaws onto their Western studios, but you would be wrong. Because in 2012 and 2013, and Square Enix once again saw financial losses. And instead of acknowledging the fact that most of their losses came from their company, they actually tried to push the blame off onto the Western studios that are now under the category of Square Enix Europe, mainly Eidos, United Front Games, and Crystal Dynamics. Yes, that's right. Eidos, the guys who created Hitman Absolution, which to this day have sold over 3.5 million units. United Front Games, who created Sleeping Dogs, which the last time I checked was well over 2 million units sold. For a new IP, that's fantastic. And Crystal Dynamics, who created the Tomb Raider reboot, which to this day has sold almost 9 million units and is by far the best-selling game in its entire franchise. Instead of acknowledging their faults, they tried to push the blame onto the companies that were financially successful in 2013 and 2012. And while we're on the topic of Crystal Dynamics and Tomb Raider, the last thing I want to talk about with Square Enix was the abysmal announcement of Rise of the Tomb Raider. Rise of the Tomb Raider was originally announced to be a multi-platform sequel to the 2013 reboot, based upon Laura's descent into madness after all the things that she saw in that game. I am very excited about playing that game, but I was shot through the heart when I heard that Microsoft was going to be publishing it for the Xbox 360 and Xbox One exclusively. Now, what we heard when we heard that exclusively, we were like, is it timed exclusive or is it a real exclusive? And then that's when the clusterfuck happened. Because then it's exclusive, it's timed exclusive, it's exclusive, it's timed exclusive, it's timed, it's not, 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 it's timed, for months, up until a point where it was so confusing that different people were giving up different bits of information so no one could tell you whether or not the game was going to be timed or not. No one even knew up until a couple months ago when they finally put down their foot and said, no, it's just timed. It is just a timed exclusive. Crystal Dynamics themselves even had to come out and apologize for the abysmal announcement of the game because no one knew whether or not it was timed or not. But if you had to ask me who I really put the blame at the feet of, whether it be Microsoft, Crystal Dynamics, or Square Enix, I would say it's Square Enix's fault. Square Enix is the parent company. They own Crystal Dynamics. They own Tomb Raider. They could have come out and easily clarified as to what the hell was going on, but they chose not to. This is one of the worst announcements for a game I have ever heard. And they should be ashamed of themselves for not being able to handle the situation like adults and actually coming out and being professional about whether or not this game was going to be a timed exclusive or not. And finally, the last publisher that I want to talk about is Microsoft. Now, Microsoft is a massive company, obviously, so let's just focus in on their games department. In their games department, they have 3 sins. Well, 2 sins and an annoyance. So let's just start with the annoyance. Games for Windows Live, another DRM system based on another DRM system. So if you were buying games on Steam, you had to deal with Steam's DRM and Microsoft's DRM. Games like Dawn of War 2 and Dark Souls Prepare to Die Edition both suffered from this heavily. Thankfully, they both got removed after Games for Windows finally died. So that's out of the way. Now let's start with another one. The second sin, the Xbox 360, mainly how it was built. The Xbox 360 was built out of a shoebox, cardboard, and staples. The thing was so flimsy that you would be blessed if you met somebody who owned an Xbox 360 that didn't have to suffer through at least one red ring of death. This became such a problem that Microsoft actually had to extend people's warranty for several years, just so we'd be able to send in our consoles to get it replaced after they broke. Now, I personally had to go through 2 consoles when it came to a red ring of death, and a third console which ended up breaking the disc tray. So I had to contact Microsoft about the disc tray problem, and they said if you have it replaced at a dingy little used game store, there'll be no issues whatsoever. So I did. I had it replaced. I brought it home and there was a console update. I said, that's not a problem. Let's update my console. And they bricked it. They bricked my console. They lied to me saying that there would be no problems with the console if I was to have it repaired at a game store. They said it would be fine. I then contacted them after it was bricked and they hung up on me 2 times. Twice. They hung up on me twice. In the middle of a sentence. They just said, fuck this guy, and hung up on me. Now, this wouldn't really be an issue to me other than the fact that I'd have to spend another $250 to buy a console, but I also had to deal with the fact that earlier in that summer, my account was banned. Now, my account was banned because it was falsely flagged for being a hacker. My account had over $700 worth of content on it. I lost over $700 worth of DLC and games because of this flagging system. Now, when my account was banned, I could still play it on my console, so it'd be fine because I still had all my stuff downloaded. But then when they bricked my console, I lost everything, and that was the last time that I wanted to deal with Microsoft. So they sent me a new Xbox to replace it, though I lost everything, so I immediately sold it and bought PlayStation 3 games. I was done with them after this. Maybe that's just too personal to be able to be put on this list, but it is something that I at least want to mention because it was fucking horse shit. And I know that I'm not the only person who had to deal with this. Most people who I think own an Xbox 360, before they went pro and before they went black and the slim, everybody had to deal with this problem. Everybody. And the last thing that I want to talk about with Microsoft in depth was the abysmal announcement of the Xbox One. Now, months leading up to the announcement of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, we heard some really nasty rumors. Mostly that they were going to require internet connections and they were going to block used game sales. And when it came to the Xbox One, it even went a step farther by saying that the Kinect was only going to be sold with the console. You were not going to be able to buy it separately. And it was going to be required to be plugged in at all times to be able to play the console. And when those game consoles were announced and officially shown off, things couldn't have gotten much worse for Microsoft. They announced a $500 price tag for a console that required an online connection at all times, had the Kinect required to be plugged in at all times, and it locked your game sales to your account, which effectively blocked people from buying and selling used games. And even if they wanted to share those games, you'd have to jump through several hoops to even be able to play those games with people on the same console as you who were using a different account. Now I want you to compare and contrast that with the PlayStation 4 announcement, which was just a smack in the face for Microsoft. They announced a $400 price tag for a game console that did not force you to use its motion control system, which they then sold separately. It did not require internet connection at all times, and best of yet, we got a commercial like this one.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
This commercial was such a smackdown for Microsoft, it gave me flashbacks back to the Genesis Does commercials.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo don't.
And you know what? Sony's strategy of just saying, let's watch what Microsoft does and then do the opposite really has paid off for them. Because in this console generation, the last time it was checked in March of 2015, Sony had sold over 22 million units in comparison to Microsoft's 12 to 14 million units. And while Microsoft has changed a lot of its policies when it comes to the Xbox One, I think they're going to suffer from this for the rest of the generation. In this place was supposed to be Activision, but there's so much stuff that I want to talk about with them that I'm actually putting them off until next week, or I actually may move them into the week after that. So in its place, I want to put two dishonorable mentions. First up is Bandai Namco. Bandai Namco is actually one of my favorite publishers on the market right now, but that doesn't mean that they are without sin. Really, their biggest issue is their inability to localize titles that people want, mainly in the Super Robot Wars, Idolmaster, and in the Digimon category. Now, when it comes to Super Robot Wars, there is somewhat of an excuse due to the fact that licensing would cost them a fortune for a lot of their games. But they also have the OG games, which are original characters created by Bandai. No licensing required, yet they still don't release it. In the Idolmaster franchise, it's just down to ignorance. They've stated before that the only reason why they don't localize Idolmaster is they don't know if there's a market for it or not. But they've heard people saying that they want the games, but they still don't want to localize them. That's just the company saying that they hate money. And when it comes to Digimon, there's absolutely no excuse. Digimon would sell like hotcakes, with the only game that people have gotten in recent memory, that weird Super Smash Brothers looking one that I don't even know if it's out or not. People want a legit Digimon game. Some of the ones that have been released for the PSP or the PS Vita are what people are clamoring for, but we hear nothing but silence. And really, I think the most damning one that most people who own a PlayStation 3 who like JRPGs knows about is Bandai Namco's inaction when it comes to people begging them to localize Tales of Vesperia for the PS3. Gamers in the West have been begging them to localize this game ever since it came out on the Xbox 360, and while at first we knew it was because there was a licensing agreement there, the licensing agreement now is expired and they could easily localize it if they want. But instead of localizing Tales of Vesperia for a Western audience, they instead tell us to go and buy the other Tales games. Oh, you want Vesperia for the PS3 to be localized? Why don't you go buy Tales of the Abyss for the 3DS? Why don't you go buy Hearts R, Graces F? Why don't you go buy Tales of Xillia or Xillia 2? Why not go buy the Symphonia HD collection? Why not wait for Zestria? You know what, on the topic of Zestria, the last thing that I want to talk about is Zestria. Now, Zestria was marketed in Japan based on the female character Alicia. Unfortunately, she leaves somewhere around the beginning to the middle of the game and then never comes back and only can be seen again if you buy a DLC. They marketed this character as being a mainstay character in the game. She was practically more important than the main character, but she ends up leaving and being DLC. Now, if you don't understand why this is a problem, you have to understand how games are marketed in Japan. When it comes to male video game characters, they are almost overwhelmingly marketed to the female audience. Games like Final Fantasy 15 are a perfect example of this, and even though Western journalists are deeming the game sexist due to the fact that it doesn't have a female playable character, these ethnocentric journalists don't realize that this game is being made for female audiences in Japan. This is what they want. Male characters running around with their shirts open and their chests exposed, killing monsters and looking cool while they do it. The same way that these male characters are marketed to the female audience, female characters are marketed to a male audience. Alicia was created to market to a male audience because they know that they make most of their money off the fact that people will buy the anime tie-in that comes out, they'll buy the $200 to $300 figurine of the character, they'll buy the wall scrolls and the posters, and if they're depraved enough, they'll even buy the body pillow. That's what these characters are marketed with. That's how they're marketed. And by putting this character in the game and saying that she's a mainstay, and then having her removed to be sold as DLC, is just shady behavior that even Bandai Namco has apologized for. And worst of all, with the game coming out in the West on the PS3 and even being rumored to come out on the PlayStation 4 and the PC, we're going to be waiting a while. And because we're going to be waiting a while and there's been this controversy, I think we're going to be getting that DLC for free, which is just going to piss off Japanese audiences even more. And the last publisher that I want to talk about today is Koei Tecmo, who are also a publisher I really like because they published the Dead or Alive series and the Dynasty Warriors, Samurai Warriors, and Warriors Orochi series. My biggest issue with them is the fact that even though we have current gen games that they could easily port to the PC, they instead pretty much screw over their PC audiences by porting the inferior PS3 and Xbox 360 versions. A good example of this would be Dynasty Warriors 8 Extreme Legends, which was released on the PlayStation 4, but instead of porting the PS4 version, which has graphics that a computer could easily render, they instead put the PS3 version on the PC. They did the same thing with Dynasty Warriors 8 Empires, which for that has no excuse because they were able to port over Dynasty Warriors 8 Extreme Legends fairly well. They could have ported over 8 Empires from the PlayStation 4, but they chose not to. The worst of all that they've done with this is Dead or Alive 5 Last Round, which was released on the PC this year, was the PS3 version instead of the current PS4, Xbox One versions, and to this day still does not have online play. There's no online for a fighting game that was released on the PC. This is absolutely unprofessional. I own it on the PC. I haven't even installed it. I'm not going to bother with it until I can play it online. Until then, I have it on the PlayStation 4 as well, which runs better, looks better, and I can play online with. There is literally no reason to buy the PC version at the moment. However, there has been rumblings that there may be an update, whether it's paid or not, that will actually update Dead or Alive 5 on PC to look like the current gen versions of the game. Now that's just a rumor, but it would be nice to see that happen for the people who've been waiting months just to be able to play the game with their friends. And with all that out of the way, we have finished with today's episode. So please come back next week to check out more publishers and more sins. And if you have the time, remember to like, favorite, comment, and subscribe, and check out GamesNosh for more UK-based gaming news. My name once again is Tyler Valle, and you guys have a great day.